In July 1993, Melchior Ndadaye became Burundi's first democratically elected president. He was also the first president to come from the country's Hutu majority. For decades up to that point, Burundi had been ruled by a small group of individuals drawn from among the Tutsi minority. President Ndadaye had come to power promising a new vision for Burundi.But within months he was murdered by soldiers. Melchior Ndadaye, March 28, 1953 to October 21, 1993, was a Burundian banker and politician who became the first democratically elected and first Hutu president of Burundi after winning the landmark 1993 election. Though he attempted to smooth the country's bitter ethnic divide, his reforms antagonized soldiers in the Tutsi-dominated army, and he was assassinated amidst a failed military coup in October 1993, after only 3 months in office. His assassination sparked an array of brutal tit-for-tat massacres between the Tutsi and Hutu ethnic groups, and ultimately led to the decade-long Burundi civil war. Melchior Ndadaye was born on March 28, 1953 in the commune of Nyabihanga, Rwanda-Urundi. The son of Pi Ndadaye and Therese Bandashubwenje, he was the first of 10 children in a Hutu family. He attended primary school in Bagara and in 1966 enrolled at the normal school in Gitega. Following the 1972 Akiza, in which the government of Burundi targeted and massacred educated Hutus, he fled to Rwanda, fearing what would happen if he returned to school in Gitega. He enrolled at the Groupe Scolaire Officiel in Butare to complete his secondary studies, graduating in 1975. He then enrolled at the National University of Rwanda to take up pedagogical studies, earning a license degree in 1980. Ndadaye lectured at the Lycée Pédagogique in Save, southern Rwanda, from 1980 to 1983. Ndadaye became involved in politics while in Rwanda, and in 1976 founded the Mouvement d'étudiants progressistes Burundi au Rwanda, BIMPER, a progressive movement for exiled Burundian Hutu students. In August 1979 Ndadaye and other Burundian exiles founded the Burundi Workers' Party, Bumugambi w'Abakozi y'Uburundi, UBU, a Marxist-Leninist political party. He served as the party's secretary for information and editor-in-chief of its newspapers, Le Flambeau and Yakuri. From 1982 to 1983 ideological divisions arose in UBU, with one faction advocating armed revolution and another led by Sylvestre Ntibantunganya and Ndadaye advocating democracy and political freedom. Ndadaye published a document calling for an alliance of Burundian progressive forces, further distancing himself from other members. As a result of the fracture, Ndadaye left UBU and returned to Burundi in 1983. In July 1984 Ndadaye married Lawrence Ninina Hazwi, with whom he had 3 children. From that year until 1986 he worked at the Centre Neuropsychiatrique Kamenge in Bujumbura. During this time he was a member of another political party, Front de lutte pour la démocratie, Fraliad, but the group disbanded after fears grew that it had been infiltrated by the government and some of its members were arrested. From 1986 until 1988 Ndadaye directed the Coopératives d'Épargne de Crédit in Gitega. In 1989 he returned to Bujumbura and became head of Meridian Bank Buyou's credit service. He then took up study with the Institut Technique de Banque at the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers in Paris, securing a diploma in higher banking studies in 1992. In June 1986 Ndadaye and other former UBU members, seeing the growing international preference for democracy and peaceful electoral processes, founded a new underground political movement, the Front for Democracy in Burundi, FRODEBU. He subsequently became the party's president. In 1988 he was named first secretary of the Gitega branch of the Union des Travailleurs du Burundi, a labor union affiliated with the ruling Union for National Progress, UPRNA, party. That year Burundi became beset by ethnic violence, and on October 23 he criticized the government of President Pierre Buyoya in a meeting called by the governor of Gitega province. As a result, he was imprisoned for 2 months in Rumanga. In February 1991 Ndadaye became one of the 12 founding members of the Itka League, a human rights association. In March, Buyoya appointed a 35-member Constitution Commission to study the country's ethnic and political problems and draft a new basic law. Ndadaye was the sole member of the political opposition to serve on it. The body produced a 145-page report titled, "The Democratization of Institutions and Political Life in Burundi." Ndadaye resigned in August, citing the Commission's lack of diversity and omissions and undemocratic provisions in the report. He was also dissatisfied with UPRNA's control over the political transition. The 1991 Constitution made provisions for multi-party politics, and on May 25, 1992, But petitioned the Ministry of Interior for official recognition, which was granted on July 23. Ndadaye remained critical of the transition, expressing anger at the government's domination by UPRNA members and accusing UPRNA activists of using state resources to support their activities. On April 18, 1993, a But Congress nominated Ndadaye as its candidate of choice for the upcoming presidential election. Viewed as a liberator of Burundi's Hutus, he also obtained the support of a coalition of minor Hutu-dominated opposition parties, the Forces pour le Changement Démocratique, FCD. Ntibantunganya, another founding But member, said that Ndadaye further benefited from a public perception that he was a political virgin. Advocating change, Ndadaye and his allies made frequent use of the phrase New Burundi, Kirundi, Burundi-Bushasha. He put forward a platform titled, "Our Proposals to Build a New Burundi," comprising 46 specific measures involving political, economic, and socio-cultural issues. He advocated disbanding the Tutsi-dominated armed forces and recreating the army and gendarmerie based on equitable recruitment from each colline, thus ensuring more ethnically balanced forces. Frodba's opponents denounced the party as a Hutu extremist organization and attempted to tie it to the Parti pour la Libération du Peuple Hutu, Palapi Hutu, a rebel group. Ndadaye decried this characterization, and instead accused UPRNA's leadership of attempting to sow ethnic division. Ndadaye, endorsed by Frodba and the FCD, competed against UPRNA's candidate, Buyoya, and Pierre Claver Sendagia of the Parti pour la Réconciliation du Peuple. In the June 1 presidential election, Ndadaye won 64.86% of the vote, whereas Buyoya only garnered 33.2% and Sendagia got 1.26%. The poll was certified by international observers as being free and fair, and none of the candidates contested the results. UPRNA members were stunned by Ndadaye's landslide victory. According to Buyoya, some party members asked him to falsify the returns to show a victory for himself, but he refused, feeling it would compromise his integrity and risk civil war. Foreign observers were also surprised by Buyoya's loss, but were generally satisfied that a civilian would assume power and that democratic processes were being followed. In the subsequent parliamentary elections on June 29, Frodba won 71.4% of the vote and earned 80% of the seats in the National Assembly. Rumors circulated in Burundi that the army would attempt to intervene to disrupt the transition. Ndadaye reassured a supporter that they can kill Ndadaye, but they can't kill all 5 million Ndadayes. A plot from a handful of officers discovered on July 3 to seize Ndadaye's residence failed due to a lack of support from other components of the military, resulting in several arrests, including that of its suspected leader, Lieutenant Colonel Sylvestre Ningaba, who had been chef de cabinet for Buyoya. Buyoya and army leaders condemned the coup attempt. When Ndadaye called Buyoya to ask him about the coup, Buyoya joked with him that it was a kind of baptism of fire. Ndadaye was sworn in as president of Burundi on July 10, 1993. He became both the first democratically elected head of state and first Hutu president of Burundi. In his inaugural address he promised to create a new Burundi. He assembled a government of 23 ministers, including 13 Frodba and 6 UPRNA members. 9 of the ministers were Tutsi, including Prime Minister Sylvie Kinigi, a member of UPRNA. He also appointed a Council of National Unity comprising 15 Hutus and 15 Tutsis who were to advise him on ethnic concerns. Despite his cautious approach to the presidency, Some of his actions nevertheless provoked tensions in the community. He questioned contracts and concessions approved under previous Tutsi governments, which threatened the economics of the powerful Tutsi elite and army. He began reforms to the military, shifting the national police to a separate command and changing the admission requirements for the military and police so as to reduce the entrenched Tutsi dominance. The dominance of But caused problems at a local level, as Ndadaye's Hutu supporters took over many positions previously held by Tutsis in the public service, and botched the resettlement of refugees returning after the 1972 massacres in such a way as to leave many Tutsi families homeless. The issues were exacerbated by the newly free press, who began reporting in such a way as to inflame ethnic tensions. He appointed Lieutenant Colonel Jean Bikomagu as Army Chief of Staff. Internationally, Ndadaye attended the signing of the Arusha Accords, a peace agreement designed to end the Rwandan civil war on August 4. His relationship with Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was tenuous. In September he went to the United Nations headquarters and addressed the General Assembly. On October 18 he attended a summit of Francophone countries in Mauritius. On October 19, 1993, an army officer approached the wife of Minister of Communications Jean-Marie Ndadaye and informed her that personnel in the army headquarters were plotting against the president. At 1500 hours on October 20, Major Isai Nibazai, the officer responsible for presidential security, informed Ndadaye's chef de cabinet of suspicious military movements. Later that afternoon, Ndadaye hosted a cabinet meeting in Bujumbura to mark the first 100 days of his presidency, which had passed 2 days prior, and discuss what his government had accomplished in comparison to its campaign promises. At the conclusion of the meeting, Ndadaye requested to speak in private with Ndadaye. In the president's office, Ndadaye raised concerns about Ndadaye's safety. Instead of informing the president about the vague threat his wife had learned of, he told him that he felt it strange that UPRNA, the Tutsi-dominated opposition party, was denouncing the government's popular policy of allowing thousands of Burundian refugees to return to the country before the commune elections in December. Ndadaye stated that he thought this would cost UPRNA the elections, and thus the only reason they would oppose the policy is if they planned to take power via an assassination and a coup. He also requested that Ndadaye further consider a previous report declaring his personal security to be inadequate. Ndadaye instructed Ndadaye to bring him the Minister of Defense, Colonel Charles Nteke. Nteke told Ndadaye that a coup was being planned by the 11th Armored Car Battalion, which was going to attack the presidential palace at 2 o'clock on October 21. When asked how he would respond, Nteke said he would gather trusted officers and organize an ambush if the battalion left its camp. Ndadaye inquired about the status of Sylvester Ngaba, a former army colonel who had been arrested in July for attempting a coup, and asked if he could be relocated to a different prison so the putschists could not obtain his help. Nteke said that this would not be possible due to the objections of prison officials to transferring detainees at nighttime, but he assured the president that he would station an additional armored car at the presidential palace for extra security. Ndadaye spoke about training possibilities for the presidential guard before dismissing both ministers for the evening and going to the palace. When he arrived he told his wife, Lawrence, about the coup plot, but was mostly assured by what Nteke had said to him. Writing on Ndadaye's willingness to return to the palace despite the threat, journalists Gaëtan Sebudandi and Pierre-Olivier Richard asserted that the president was probably convinced that the coup would be easily foiled, just like the plot on July 3. Kruger wrote, that a president as intelligent as Ndadaye's associates found him to be would so readily accept such scant preparations for his protection seems, in retrospect, remarkable to an outsider. However, in a capital perpetually nervous with rumor, it becomes exhausting to take seriously every reported threat. Moreover, Ndadaye may have had a kind of che sera, fatalistic attitude that could come to a person who, having overcome numerous life-threatening challenges, was unwilling to run away from the position and responsibilities he had so recently assumed. At around midnight on October 20, Putschists of the 11th Armored Car Battalion departed from Camp Muha in over a dozen armored cars and took up positions around Bujumbura. Within an hour they surrounded the presidential palace. They were joined by hundreds of soldiers and gendarmes from the other 11 military camps in Bujumbura, including members of the 1st Parachute Battalion and a few personnel from the 2nd Commando Battalion. They prepared to attack the palace, which was only guarded by 38 soldiers of the Presidential Guard and 2 armored cars. Shortly before 1 o'clock on October 21, Ndadaye called the president and told him that armored cars had left Camp Muha for an unknown destination and advised him to leave the palace immediately. Ndadaye then attempted to reach Captain Ildefonse Mushwabur, the commander of the palace guard, by phone, but when he did not answer he went into the palace gardens. At 1:30 the Putschists fired a single shot, and shortly thereafter at least one armored car blasted a hole in the grounds wall and began bombarding the palace with cannon fire. Lawrence Ndadaye took her 3 children into an interior room and sheltered them under tables, while the president was disguised in a military uniform by his guards and placed in one of their armored cars in the garden, where he remained for the next 6 hours. At about 7:30, Lawrence Ndadaye and her children left the palace and reached one of the 2 cars on the grounds, which would not start. They quickly reunited with President Ndadaye, who was in the other armored vehicle. The family considered scaling the perimeter wall to go to the neighboring Meridian Hotel, but found that the palace was completely surrounded by Putschists. At Captain Mushwabur's direction, Ndadaye decided to be taken with his family to Camp Muha. At 7:30 they left in their armored car, and were trailed by the Putschists' vehicles. Upon arriving at the base at 8 o'clock, their car was surrounded by Putschists of the 1st Battalion. Ndadaye was taken by Army Chief of Staff Bikomagu to a meeting with other senior officers of the army. About an hour later he returned with Secretary of State for Security Colonel Lazare Gikurio, having reached a verbal agreement with the officers. Ndadaye re-entered the armored car with Gikurio to finalize their understanding on paper, but when the Secretary of State exited the vehicle soldiers began shouting for the president to come out. Once he did, Bikomagu quieted the crowd and Ndadaye appealed to the soldiers to negotiate peacefully with him. Soldiers began closing in on the president, and Bikomagu instructed them to let his family go since they were of no interest to them. He directed a driver to take the family away, and at Lawrence's direction, the soldier brought them to the French embassy, where they were allowed to take refuge. Bikomagu then pointed at President Ndadaye and said to the Putschists, "He is the one you were looking for. Here he is. Do what you want with him." They placed Ndadaye in a jeep and drove him to the 1st Parachute Battalion's camp nearby, closely followed by Bikomagu, Gikurio, and Major Ndadaye. The president was taken to an office where 10 junior officers specifically assigned to the task killed him. A coroner's report later found that Ndadaye was held by a cord around his neck while the soldiers bayoneted him 14 times. Half of the wounds penetrated his thorax and the subsequent bleeding filled up his lungs, killing him. The soldiers then dug a mass grave in the center of the camp, where they buried Ndadaye, President of the National Assembly Ponchan Karabwami, Vice President of the National Assembly Gilby But, Minister of Home Affairs and Communal Development Juvenal Ndadaye, and Director of Intelligence Richard Ndikumwami. After several hours the soldiers realized that international opinion would strongly disapprove of such treatment of the bodies, so they exhumed them and allowed family members to collect them. Ndadaye was reburied on December 6 in a ceremony in Bujumbura alongside other officials killed in the coup. Ndadaye's death sparked severe ramifications across the country. The attempted coup rapidly failed, as François Ngeze, the civilian politician installed as temporary head of state, refused to support the coup leaders and called for Prime Minister Kinigi, who had survived the coup and was in hiding at the French embassy, to assume control, a move soon backed by key military chiefs. Kinigi was thus appointed as acting president while a resolution to the constitutional crisis caused by the assassination of both the president and the president of the assembly was found. The United Nations Security Council condemned the assassination and coup, and was soon followed in doing so by the United Nations General Assembly. Many thousands of civilians, on both sides, were killed in the resulting carnage, with estimates varying but generally agreed to be above 100,000. The ongoing violence developed into the decade-long Burundi civil war. A United Nations investigation into Ndadaye's murder, the result of which was released in 1996, accused the army command of being responsible for the assassination and of being complicit in the resulting massacres by Tutsi troops. It did not name specific figures as being responsible, but Buyoya, Ndadaye's predecessor as president, has long been suspected of having some role in the assassination. In 1999, as part of attempts to end the civil war, an array of arrests were made of those suspected of involvement in the Ndadaye assassination. 5 men, including the alleged ringleader, Army officer Paul Kamana, were sentenced to death, and 74 others received sentences ranging from 1 year to 20 years. Most of the high-ranking officials charged, however, were acquitted, in a verdict condemned by Ndadaye's supporters. In Burundi, Ndadaye has been posthumously remembered as a martyr for democracy and a national hero. Ndadaye Day is observed annually on October 21 to commemorate his death. The day is commemorated by the laying of a wreath on the tomb of Ndadaye. During President Pierre Nkurunziza's tenure as president, the government erected a monument jointly honoring Ndadaye and Louis Rwagasore at a roundabout in Bujumbura. Thank you for watching for this video.